All right. Welcome to this session around innovating creative business models in immersive. Just give me a second and I'll share my screen. Okay, I'm just waiting for it to come up. Okay, so yeah, thanks for joining. So this talk will be about business models in immersive and within the creative industry. So my name is Aki Järvinen. I work at Digital Catapult in London, and what I'm going to present to you today is findings from our second research project that we've conducted on behalf of UKRI as part of the audience of the Future program. And I'm going to use something like 15 to 20 minutes to go through the highlights of the research, which is out today in the form of a report. So I'll share the link to the report in a minute. And just before that, I also want to make the point that this is a piece of research that is building on our first research project in the same program, which was called the Immersive Audience Journey, came out in July. And there's also a report available about that. And that was our take on how immersive producers in the creative space think about audiences. And as one of the outputs of the report, we kind of framed our insights and findings regarding that topic into what we call the immersive audience journey, which is basically an application of the so-called customer journey and thinking about how that kind of a design thinking approach should be and could be applied to immersive productions. And so, as said, a second report out today, and this is very much building on the first project. It's called the UK Creative Immersive Landscape in 2020. Business Models in Transition is the subtitle. And bear with me a second. I will now post a link to the chat in the space. Once I get that tab running, hopefully. Having some issues accessing the tab. Okay, here we go. So yeah, the report will be up at audienceofthefuture.live, which is the program site. But at the moment, you can find it through that link that I shared on our site, Digital Catapult's website, under News and Insights and Publications. But the link should take you directly there. And here you have, I have no idea if you're seeing what I'm seeing, kind of like a fast forward of the different things that we have in the report, but this is really meant to, as this whole session, meant to function as a kind of a teaser to get you to download the report and continue the discussion afterwards. So as you can see, we cover different things, and we've tried to, as the forms of output from the research, we've really tried to come up with practical tools and approaches that producers in the creative immersive space could use going forward when they try to solidify and grow their business. But anyhow, so what we set out to do was to map the key challenges in this creative immersive space that studios and startups out there have in generating sustainable revenue. And so to begin with, we identified a few themes: business models, production technologies, distribution, and also the user experience as keys for thinking about how to unlock revenue and profitability in this space. And so the report basically paints this landscape where within the UK, creators of immersive content are trying to sustain a business. We do that through 4 case studies, company stories, as we call them in the report, where we followed 4 UK startups in the space for 6 months in their efforts of trying to launch a production in this space. And of course, when we first set out to do that, this was January, February. And then the pandemic hit, and Some of the plans of those companies changed, some of them less so. But anyhow, we documented that in a brief format, the stories, and we've used that as part of our sample of trying to say something meaningful about this space. And really what comes through as observations, findings, and themes are that the immersive creative industries is a very complex network where there are very innovative ideas and work going on, working with emerging technologies that are a bit of a moving target. There's the whole question of adoption in the consumer side of things, which is fledgling to more or less. I would say we have distribution channels, but they tend to be quite fragmented, and definitely making these things requires cross-disciplinary skill sets. So what you see here is basically a visualization of the structure of the report, but also how we proceeded throughout the research. And there's quite a lot of information there, so I'll walk you through now in the next 10 to 15 minutes of what does this include, and then I will say a number of times that you will find more details in the report, but that's just how it is. I will touch upon the key things here. So first of all, those themes, which we basically translated into research questions. So for instance, regarding revenue, that, okay, how do immersive producers in this space approach the question of revenue in the first place? Are they even thinking about profitability, or are there creative aspirations like the primary motivation? How do they think about revenue streams, ticketing, things like that? Then this also, of course, ties into business models. So if we understand business model as the way that a company operates, the sort of operational logic with which they try to both create value, but also capture value. So say if a creative immersive producer, a studio, makes a location-based production out there, puts it on display, how do they, what do they think that is the attraction, the sort of engagement in that production? And so how do they create that value? And then how do they capture the value from asking people to, for instance, buy a ticket or download it, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, the question of technology tends to be quite central here, because most of these technologies are quite, in a nascent immersion state. And how does that feed into the creative aspirations of the producers and vice versa? And then distribution, collected, okay, what does it actually take to get your work out there, and how are choices in distribution? For instance, now that we are living still in the middle of the pandemic, how does your choice of actually setting out to do and make a location-based production, how has that choice, is that changing, forcing you more or less to change your business model? So all of these things actually factor into the business model, and especially the choices that those creatives make. And so going into those company stories that I mentioned, so these are the 4 companies: Limina Immersive, Megaverse, No Ghost, and Playlines. Some of you might have heard Rob from Playlines giving a talk about the National Gallery X AR application that they produced. But anyhow, so some of these companies like Limina, Megaverse, Playlines, they were very much focused on location-based concepts, whereas No Ghost has been working towards something for the VR headset space, and therefore actually hasn't had to change their plans and their production as much as the others. And so, as said, we document the sort of 6-month story of these companies during our spell of research and what happened to them, and we draw conclusions from that. But because in the early stages of the research, we were in this situation, we weren't sure quite how well these companies might be able to proceed with their productions amidst the pandemic. Therefore, we also sought like a complementary sample for the research, and I'll come back to that later on. And going into this research, we having worked at the Catapult and sort of being able to observe quite a lot of immersive companies coming and going, trying to create sustainable business, we had a certain set of hypotheses going into this research. And most of these hypotheses turned out to be accurate. So for instance, this observation that there tends to be this phenomenon where small immersive producers go on from project to project with grant funding or client-funded projects, and they tend to have this effort and this longer-term goal of building and investing into their own intellectual property, but it's hard to find that traction, so that they kind of have to work from project to project, grant to grant, and they sort of end up in that sort of a perpetual R&D instead of reaching that sort of growth trajectory. And this is kind of tied into the fact that for most of these people, it seems to be that creative aspirations, that creating that production rather than thinking primarily about its profitability. That's the motivating factor. And a second one was that because of the technologies that they're working with, and also audiences' understanding of these productions and technologies, that means that also the business models are in a constant flux. So some of the technologies that they need to adopt to create and fulfill their creative visions are not mature, and that might mean that there's lots of trial and error, sort of trying to find ways that work, and that again affects those choices, and those iterations and trials and errors feed into how they have to innovate around their business model in order to survive, basically, continuously. And then often, as a related thing, this thing with technology is that real-time technologies like game engines that are predominantly used to create these productions, at the same time, those producers are in a position to take advantage of these tools' capabilities, but they are also often the creative aspirations sort of force and drive them to push the boundaries of these technologies. And that just sort of takes them into areas where there's quite a small professional like a pool of people who can actually execute these things. And often they might be in full-time jobs and more stable jobs, and this kind of a vicious circle of trying to find the best people to create the best things, again, makes things a bit more difficult. And then distribution often also kind of, I wouldn't say that comes as an afterthought, but it's something that just isn't very refined in this team's thinking necessarily, that, or at least sort of the finding the best distribution platform and choice in terms of thinking about what is the most profitable channel is not very developed. And because often the background of these people comes from the creative side of things, and that's not just necessarily in their mindset. And therefore they need to engage with partnerships, but that kind of a relationship building with platform owners or venue owners, for instance, can be time consuming, and contracting issues and things like that take more time than necessary. And also at the moment, it's kind of like easy to say that if you have a location-based production, then shouldn't you now make the shift to digital because of the pandemic? And it's not that these companies wouldn't have thought about that, but it's often a question of resources again, that, okay, do they have the capability or the resources to pivot to those platforms? So those hypotheses pretty much turned out to be correct as we went through this spell of time and research. And of course, then that leads to the question that, okay, how could producers in this creative space manage and navigate these issues better? And also that, okay, everyone, regardless of the vertical, because of the pandemic, has had to do at least some amount of business model innovation, in the sense that they've had to rethink the logic of how their business works. And so many of the problems that I outlined in those hypotheses just now are similar in the creative immersive space as in the rest of the creative industries. So therefore, if we want to tackle the particularity of immersive producers' challenges in creating sustainable businesses, we need to identify what are the particular characteristics in this space in comparison to the, let's say, more traditional creative industries. And what you see here is a number of areas which sort of try to capture that those characteristics that are particular to immersive production. So from the fact that often it's not about, for instance, film production, it's at least as much a software development project when you create these things. And often it requires certain kind of fringe technology expertise, for instance. There's not like a screenwriting in the traditional sense. It's more about content diagramming in relation to a space that you're trying to build. So there's multiple things here that make this space kind of like distinctive, I would argue. And now if we want to then think about that, okay, how should these companies think about their business models in a more structured way? Those particular characteristics sort of open up the opportunity space to sort of think about that, okay, what types of shifts has happened when the pandemic hit, and how should people in this space think about developing their business in a more structured way? And that's what we're trying to give tools and tools for thought and also practical application through this research. And so to do that, we went into academic research and academic literature on business models, and especially business models in relation to disruptive technologies and emerging technologies. And there's lots of research having to do, for instance, business model patterns. So this idea that you could look at how companies operate and divide it into small patterns that you could then use to sort of analyze how to rethink or reconfigure your business model and your operations. And many of those models are not very accessible, but the one that you see here is the one that we choose to use as a kind of like a lens to look at, for instance, what happened to those case study companies of ours. So basically 5 questions that, okay, what is the unique value proposition of the company? Who are they targeting? Who is their customer? How are they doing that? What are the revenue streams? So like how much does it cost? And again, for whom are they making these productions? And so we use this, which is called like a business model configuration approach from the literature to look at our companies. And also then we combined those particular characteristics with these elements of this business model configuration model. And this, again, is there to try to help companies to think that, okay, if we pivot and if we invest in certain things, what are the important things to consider? And to make it a bit more tangible, then we went through what happened in the business model configurations of our case study companies. So for instance, Megaverse here I use as an example. They had to move from a location-based model. They had to move from selling tickets on site to other projects which are direct-to-consumer to digital platforms, for instance. So those arrows that you see there at the bottom shows those transitions of how they used to operate before the pandemic and what they sort of need to consider or pivoted to during the pandemic. And in the report, we do the same analysis to those 4 case study companies. So again, more detail in the report. Now, the other practical thing that comes out of this research is very much what we call the immersive production matrix. So that's what I want to cover next. And so this is a tool, basically a lens to look at any creative immersive production from the perspective of its distribution choices, technology choices, and then also what type of user experience in terms of the 7 senses it tries to capture. And these are, of course, very closely interrelated. They sort of come together in a production. And the more ambitious, I would say, in the immersive space the production is, the more sort of boxes in this matrix you tick. So if you think about maybe the like ultimate example within this framework would be the Star Wars Galaxy's Edge theme park in Florida that Disney is running, which has a number of different attractions, both immersive and more traditional. But so they would tick quite a few of these boxes, ranging from different technologies that they employ to different ways that they distribute and employ them within the theme park, to how many senses do those experiences and the whole thing kind of like address. And again, this ties into the idea that choices in this space affect and shape the business model of a company. So if a company, for instance, decides to go for a, let's say, a quite experimental multi-sensory technology that addresses the sense of taste, for instance, then that means that there needs to be some know-how having to do with quite a sort of fringe technology and how you distribute that. Obviously, it's very almost impossible, at least at the moment, to distribute that to a home audience. So again, that shapes the business logic, how you create and capture value and the whole configuration. And so obviously, when you create this kind of a framework, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing that you have to look at the sample of projects, and then that feeds into what you put into the model. And so, as I said in the beginning, because there was a moment where we weren't really sure how much sort of information, data we would get from the 4 case study companies, then what we did, we were in a position to expand our sample to the Creative XR program that we have been now running for 3 years at Digital Catapult. So what we did, we looked at the successfully funded projects throughout those 3 cohorts, and we analyzed which of the technologies, this is the example here in the screen, which technologies did they want to employ in their projects. And we did the same across the distribution and the user experience. So again, all those analyses are in the report. And for instance, the takeaway from this graph here is that the combination of virtual reality that brings together or brings with it spatial audio and a physical set in a location, that has been the predominant combination of technologies until now. So obviously, we already started seeing a shift in that in the year 3 cohort because of the situation that we have at hand. But anyhow, so the key thing there is that the immersive production matrix is kind of like an analysis framework, and it's really like a discussion starter for companies who think that, okay, which technology should we try to employ and how can you think about these things? And so the other practical outputs are set of business model innovation tools, and then I want to end up with a couple of these future scenarios that we put out there to really sort of provoke the discussion. And again, as with the first piece of research that I mentioned in the beginning, so the immersive audience journey, it was really important for us to come up with practical outputs. So the immersive audience journey approach is quite a practical way to think about how you engage audiences with your production in the different phases, not only the production itself when it's out there, but also starting to create awareness and what happens after the audience has experienced your production. So in a similar fashion, what we wanted to do here is provide a template that helps companies in the immersive production creative space to think about their business model choices. And so for that, we applied approaches from one particular EU research project that ran for a few years just recently. And what that project did was it basically took the existing business model innovation literature and tried to create a more accessible approach for startups and SMEs across different verticals. And so then the practical output from that research project was these 3 business model innovation paths. So you see one example here, which is related to that, okay, I want to make my business more profitable. That is what the entrepreneur, the business owner wants to do. And then the path that you see here, there at the top of the graph is outlining different measures, different activities that might help you get there. And then as a creative exercise, what you can do with this template is to think that, okay, what are the actual particular activities that would, for instance, get us to know our audience better, and so on and so forth, those elements there in the path. And so, and then we want to kind of combine this with the immersive production matrix to inspire thinking that, okay, how does this relate to our choices in distribution, technology, and user experience? And how does that whole rethinking of the business logic, i.e. business model innovation, come from there? So we provide templates for this path, but there are 2 other paths. One is starting a new business, and the other one is I want to grow my business rather than just make it more profitable. So again, those are in the report. And we intend to use these in practical settings, for instance, in the programs that we run in the Catapult, and also continue to disseminate these results in the in the form of workshops where we take these tools into practice with immersive companies out there. And the final thing is that I won't go into this in much detail, but also, I mean, because we are facing uncertainty and nobody can predict future. Scenario thinking is one way to not predict the future, but think about the alternative forms the future could take. And we end with the report with 3 kind of deliberately provocative scenarios, both optimistic, pessimistic, and neutral, of where this creative immersive space could go. So for instance, ranging from very sort of optimistic view where things more or less come back to normal, the vaccine works and all that great stuff. But, you know, of course, we wish that everything would play out that way, but we can't really be sure. So as to balance things out, we also provide a couple of more or less optimistic scenarios. So again, these are meant to inspire thinking and inspire debate of where this space really should be going and what should be done to make it more sustainable. So all that is in the report. And so I hope you can access the link that I posted. And at this point, I think I will stop sharing, and I'm very happy to take questions. Michael Miller, what do you see the end result being in immersive experience? Could you elaborate a bit end result in terms of in terms of outcome for a particular audience member or for the business? Okay, while maybe Michael will elaborate on the question, I'll answer Jessica's question. So definitely what we're trying to do towards the end of the Audience of the Future program. So the question is about what is going to be next on the research agenda. So what we hope to do is actually collate these 2 pieces of research into kind of like a toolkit that would bring them together and package them in a form that is accessible. And actually, the other thing what we are in process of doing is to commission a piece of market research, because obviously what is important here is that if you want to innovate your business model and try to think about some of those choices that I was talking about regarding technology and so on and so forth, any understanding of the market size might be a deciding factor. So for instance, the actual adoption of a certain kind of end user device, or the footfall and the expectations of a market size for a location-based experience. And this is really the data that is lacking, because it's mostly either being held by just individual companies who have run a few productions out there, or platform owners who don't share that. So we're trying to get to a point where we would be able to sort of basically map the size of the UK market so that companies out there could have a more informed, basically make more informed choices of where to target and think about really to sort of manage their expectations. And of course, this also fits into something like if you are seeking investment, the more understanding of the market size and also your audience you have, the better chances you, I would say, have in convincing investors, for instance. While I wait for other questions, I'll try to answer Michael's question. So what do you see the end result being in immersive experience? I mean, from the point of view of this piece of research, I think the key question is that many of these companies don't really think about profitability. And I kind of realized that from my own creative background that you have this creative aspiration and you want to create an immersive experience for people who experience something unique, but it doesn't necessarily become a habit or anything like that. But still, I do think that we're in a very important point in time regarding where the chances of this creative immersive space, for instance, is in terms of growing. So this could go either way, depending on how the future plays out, for instance, for location-based productions. And therefore, I just do think that it's a time to think about the sustainability of this kind of a business activity and even its profitability in a more serious manner, because otherwise we are kind of in this perpetual R&D where companies go produce something exciting and unique, but are not able to scale up. And that will eventually affect, for instance, newcomers to the space. So if there are passionate creative entrepreneurs who think about entering the immersive space, but if they don't hear success stories, if they only hear stories of R&D projects that didn't manage to scale up, they will look at something else. So I think there is that kind of a sort of a momentum shift would need to happen where these companies are able to go from this R&D type of activity to actually scaling up their projects. And we have seen some success, of course, in that space, but then now the pandemic has disrupted, for instance, the location-based market. And so companies that were able to gain some traction or even more traction in that space, like Marshmallow, Laserfeast, Punch Drunk for long decades already, almost. Now they face the risk of if not disruption, then actually rethinking about their business models as well. And the traction that they've had in the past, it's faces uncertainty whether they're able to pick up that traction, or are they forced to go back to that sort of R&D work to reinvent themselves. So yeah. So the end result, while not from the business point of view, not necessarily always profitability. I mean, commissioned project might have other means. They might sort of, their main function might be to create and prove some sort of cultural value and create awareness and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, that will just perpetuate the project-based, grant-based model where these sort of scaling up stories in the space don't necessarily happen. Okay, good. So I'm glad, Michael, I was able to at least partially address your question. So there's much more in the report about this. I've sort of been waving my hands around about this sort of explorative prototyping space and then this growth space. And I'm using a specific model in the report to sort of think about that space and the sort of risk versus potential growth and all that kind of stuff. So again, more stuff in the report. Have a look. Maybe I should repost that link because I think there's a few people who have come into the session after the beginning. So what I'll do is I'll post the link again. So that's the full report which you can find. If not, I think we are then ready to close this session. Again, okay, Michael, another one. So Michael's question is about, is the promise in startups in niche hidden communities that can enter this market with the amount of risk? Yeah, that's a good question. I would hope so, and I think it has been, like, for instance, the function and goal of funding from both programs like the Audience of Future, but also Creative XR that I've mentioned, to really give a chance for these kinds of more niche productions to get that initial traction. But and in the sense, I do believe that overall, given the sort of state of adoption, especially in the home consumer market with immersive technology, is that it's not about necessarily the realistic goals for a company are not necessarily, gigantic amounts of reach and profit, but finding those viable niches. And if then you are a company that represents a certain type of niche, let's say like a secret cinema type of audience, and they understand how that audience engages with these productions and what they appreciate in the content, I do think that you're in a better place to cater for that audience. And that might be a viable niche in itself, but it doesn't remove the risk. And it's all about the execution in the last place. Everybody has ideas, but if you can't execute towards those, and then still, regardless of the fact that many of the production technologies are becoming more accessible and available and cheaper, it still takes money to make these things properly. So it is a challenging space in that sense, but I want to hope and see that there's new success stories in those kinds of niche communities going forward. Yeah, I think so. Mike Harris asked about immersive creative business models with other immersive sectors, health tech or education. Certainly there are crossover in terms of the production technologies, of course, that you would use. I suppose the main difference would be that unless you are creating some kind of a serial production, episodic content, for instance, then these productions on the creative side of things tend to be like one-offs, which might build the brand of the studio. So if you think about a studio like Darkfield, who creates these audio-based AR experiences, they created a certain name and they have a certain brand and so on and so forth. But their productions tend to be like one-off things. Whereas if you aim to create something, for instance, for the educational health sector, I would imagine that you would try to create a platform that has a continuous use and really tries to tap into some certain kind of a task or a routine thing and tries to solve that. So in that sense, you might be in a kind of like a better opportunity to create something that gains instant traction and solves a problem and becomes a widespread solution that you can then develop further. Whereas in the content creative space, you are easily then, even if you manage to create the traction, the risk there is to get to this sort of content treadmill where you have created a platform but then created the content itself is quite expensive in terms of time and money. So therefore, you need to sort of constantly be sort of running the treadmill of creating content, and that's hard to scale after a while. So this is something that, for instance, have been seen to happen in more sort of mature markets, like, for instance, mobile gaming, where the most like loyal customers churn the content. And if you want to keep your loyal customers, then you need to just create more and more content to them, and scaling that up can be difficult. And so I think that's sort of a kind of like a difference in business logic. The business model might be the biggest difference there. if we think about sort of cross the creative and cross something like health or manufacturing, for instance. I think we are almost out of time, so thank you for your questions. I'm happy to continue the discussion. I showed my email, but I'll just type it here. So if you want to reach me, and also, of course, all my social media profiles are in the speaker bio in the schedule, but yeah, there's my email if you want to reach me. So with that, I think we are good. So thank you for joining, and I'll see you around.